Thank you all for joining us today. I know it's a beautiful sunny day out there. We've only got so many of these left this summer, but we've got a lot of fun things to talk about with real estate. So we're gonna get going here in just a few minutes. Looks like we've already have, what, 13, 14 people. People are starting to stack up here. It usually takes about another 2 or 3 minutes to get everybody logged in. But once again, thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions at the end, please send us a note. We'll send a follow-up email on this. We can provide slides, we can provide feedback. We can set up a custom meeting to talk about specific questions you might have. But what I would love to do today is inform the discussion with what's on your mind. So I've got two people here with me today, Jimmy Griggs and Steve Lacrosse, both members of the lab group. And Jamie's got a fun new poll that we're using. And Jamie, can you take over the screen there and pull that up? Wonderful. So we're going to play with this today. And for anyone that doesn't know what a QR code is, I'm not sure where you were during the pandemic, but we're going to try it. So on the bottom left side of your screen is it's a QR code, and either you can go to menti.com, or if you just pull up your phone, put your camera at it, what it's going to do is ask you one question. The question of today is, how do you feel about the real estate market? And I know that's a super general question, but I just want to get your first gut reaction. Don't think about it. There we go. We're starting to come up. We're hearing a lot of that, Steve, aren't we?
Oh yeah. I mean, you'll hear it a lot. We'll go through a lot of the headlines. We'll go through a lot of the metrics that people are seeing, and yeah, all of these are right in line with what we're hearing.
Yeah, we're hearing these. We're here for you, and that's why we're doing a webinar, because we feel that when you have information filtered through experience, we can actually get to an understanding where you can actually make calm decisions. If you're following the headlines, if you're following what's on the news stations, it's really hard to understand what's happening in real estate. And what's surprising to us is that when we talk to buyers and sellers, a lot of times they make decisions based on their gut feel or what they think is happening in the market. And it's based on supermarket conversations. It's based on a conversation they had with one person, et cetera. But yet it's the most important financial decision of their life. Real estate historically is the #1 investment in anyone's net worth, but yet those decisions are often relatively poorly informed. So I really appreciate everyone being open and honest with how you're feeling, because we've got a lot of good data to talk about. Steve and I have the habit, if you let us, we'll get into a lot of graphs and charts and spreadsheets. So we're going to try to remove ourselves from that today. We boiled it down to a dozen little talking points that really synthesizes and tells the story of the overall market. So I don't want to spend too much more time here, but if anyone who's just joined, this is an active participation slide. Pick up your phone. You can scan that QR code on the bottom left and just answer that one question. We're going to give this about 1 more minute, and then we'll move on. And this will really help us understand how you're feeling, so we can address that here in the next 15 or 20 minutes. We're going to keep it very succinct today and try to answer as many questions as you have. And speaking of which, once we get going and you have more questions, please go to the chat, and send us any questions. We can create an open two-way dialogue. We're live, we're real, and we're here for you. So let's have a conversation.
I think as we're seeing these responses come up, I think what we find a lot with our clients is balancing the not being sure, the uncertainty, the risk, some of the words that I'm seeing. They're balancing that with the fact that a home, yes, it is a big financial decision and it is a big investment, but it also represents the opportunity to take a new job, move, start in a new place. And so there's something emotional that's drawing them to it, but then there's this financial, more analytic side. And that the balance of the two is where this is where we love to spend time with our clients, is trying to figure out how to balance that so that you can make the wisest, most educated decision across the emotional and the more analytical end of the spectrum.
Yep. Housing provides everything from emotional stability to grow your family to, you know, your financial future. So there's a lot of factors involved. So let's move on. We've waited our 5 minutes. Thank you all for joining. Let's keep those words in mind here. Let me share my screen, and we're going to hop over to what we're going to talk about today. So everything that you brought up on that first screen, unsure, etc., plays right into what we're seeing nationwide. So this first graph, this is consumer confidence in home prices. This is where consumers think price, or how many, or what percentage of Americans think housing prices are going to go down in the next 12 months. Historically, you know, since about 2010, anywhere from about 10 to 20%. There's always 10 or 20% that think prices are going to go down next year. But that really spiked last year in 2022, and that's with good reason. Interest rates went from 3 to 8%. There was talk of recession, et cetera, et cetera. The Fed went after the Fed funds rate to slow down inflation, which had a direct impact on housing. There's a lot of commercial debt issues on the commercial side of real estate. A lot of people had a lot of fear associated with that. From what we saw here in Bend, Oregon, what we saw in residential housing nationwide, we were looking at a very different data set. And we didn't feel prices were going to go down very much. We were seeing some small variations off of that. And that is what played out. And we're going to get to why that is. Now, historically, the public is about 3 to 6 months behind reality. The headlines that they're seeing are written by journalists that are following passively, looking at data on properties that closed, which were usually under contract 30, 60, 90 days before. So at very least, usually the buyer and seller sentiment of what's really happening on the ground of real estate is at least a quarter behind. And as it strengthened, especially in the second half of 2022, the public has started to catch up on that. So instead of 40% of Americans thinking the housing prices were going to go down in the last 12 months, that has gone from about 40% all the way down to about 25%, which is not that far off of historical average. So that means, you know, 60%, 2 out of 3 2 out of 3 people in the market right now don't think that housing prices will remain flat or be going up in the next month. And that's really reflected in the data that we see. So the Case-Shiller, CoreLogic, et cetera, these are some aggregators of month-over-month pricing. And this really shows that softening that we had at the end of last year, partially driven by the annual cyclical, like this chart, you could almost use it for any year over the last 10 years. There's always a softening in prices, second half of the year over the winter. But this shows the softening between the normal seasonal fluctuations and the interest rates that we saw last year. But if you look at the whole chart, we're seeing that prices have been climbing pretty steadily on a month-by-month basis since about February and March. Steve, do you want to talk about how we're seeing that here in Bend regarding price?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the biggest things that you'll hear in the headlines is what the market has done, what the median home price has done. And you know, what we've got here is a rolling 3-month average so that we can smooth it out a little bit. If you look at a month-to-month basis, a month-to-month change in the median home price, there were multiple times this year where that moved month over month 7%. And we go through, we just finished our state of the market. There are some reasons for that. Most notably, it's sectors of the market that are moving, the small number of homes that are selling, and so that those numbers can be affected. But Jamie can put in the state of the market link so that people can have access to that. But what we're looking at here is the reality is that over the course of the last year, we're up about 3% on a rolling 3-month average. The Bend median price, this is all types, is up about 3%. It's down on a 12-month average. So if you stretch that out even further, it's almost unchanged. One of the things that we just talked about in our latest market report was, you know, if you do back up it, and it really is summarized by that last chart that you just showed, Brian. If you look at this, we are essentially our median home price right now, although it's fluctuated quite a bit month to month, we are almost exactly where we were about a year ago, and we're just slightly off the highs of that early February, March timeframe of 2022. So, you know, if you look at the headline, it'll say median home price down 7.5% this month. But the reality is we are steady. We peaked out in early 2022. There were, factors in the market that caused us to slowly move a little bit lower. But the reality is this year we've steadily ticked back up throughout the course of the year. So
yeah, and really what we saw in those prices, that peak in February, March, April of 2022, that was a reflection of the end of the pandemic migration of purchases that happened at the end of 21 at relatively low interest rates. This is when interest rates were still 4 or 5%, and there was that big run up. And that was a very relatively short period of time. And what Steve's talking about is that was really an anomaly. And if you look at individual months of February, March, April of this year versus only that February or only that March of last year, that's what's driving the housing prices went down 10%, et cetera, et cetera. But when you average it with some rolling data, 60, 90-day data, it's not nearly as scary. And it's more informative that what we saw really was just a slowdown of an odd peak. Prices haven't corrected that much. We're about flat on average, and it affected a relatively small percent of the buyer and seller pool. But what we're also seeing here is sales are down, and let's get to that. And what we're seeing is nationwide sales are down about 16, 17%. And in Bend, we're down about 10%. So we're not seeing as much of a pullback in the volume that we're seeing nationwide. But this isn't as much of a buyer issue of buyers not buying because they're scared. It's one, they're a little bit maxed out on interest rates. The high housing prices, which didn't come back very much, are a challenge. So it's challenging to be a buyer right now. But frankly, the biggest issue, the elephant in the room here, is inventory. And the lack of inventory is really what's slowing down the pending sales. And it's also what is holding up these prices. Because with a doubling of interest rates, we should have seen more of a softening in prices. But what we were pointing at 6 months ago, 9 months ago, was that there's simply no homes available. So Steve, do you want to talk about kind of the history? This is the big chart dating back to 2004 of months of supply of inventory here in Bend.
Yeah, absolutely. So just quick reminder, when we're talking about months of supply, it's taking into account how many homes sell on average in a given month and how many homes are available. So if nothing new comes available, how long would it take to work through the existing inventory? And so that's when they quote 2 months, 3 months. That's what the number means. And so yes, if we look at what our inventory has done, if we just had the very far right side of that chart, we would see that inventory is up almost 50% from where it was at this time last year or at some point last year. However, when you zoom back, and I can't see, this goes back all the way to 2004, you can see on average, we are still significantly under where we are, where the normal range would be. A balanced market, they usually quote at about 5 or 6 months of inventory, and we're at 3.5 months. And that's Bend overall. And we might touch on this topic a few times. Individual segments of the market will have different supply rates. They'll have different sales rates. There will be, it is very important to be looking at certain price points, certain demographics, certain areas, because if you take the 500,000 and under price point right now, there's less than a month's worth of inventory.
Yeah.
So it is important to keep that in perspective.
Yeah. So this massive shortage in housing is driven by a couple different factors. Let's get into those because I think that's going to help us inform people of saying, okay, just because we have a shortage right now, if people start putting their homes on the market, are we going to have a flood of homes? Is that going to create softening of the prices? And when I'm buying at peak pricing, prices are going to go down. Here's some of the data that'll help us have that discussion. So now this is an interesting one. This is a nationwide measurement, but we see it's almost identical when you go to housing starts here in Bend. This shows housing starts nationwide since the 1970s. That seems like a long time ago, but that was my era. So this is my lifetime here. And what it shows is that as soon as we hit that Great Recession in 2007, banks cut off their support for builders and developers. They stopped lending to them, et cetera, et cetera. And it took 3, 4, 5 years to even get that machine turned back on. and it never really caught up. 2022 was the first year we reached the average house production. Here in Bend, we just crossed the 1,800 housing permits a year, but there were a lot of years in 2010, 11, 12, where housing permits were measured in the hundreds, 200, 300, 400 a year. And I had a good meeting with Eric King, who's the city manager for Bend yesterday. And he said, Brian, we're short 5,000 homes in Bend if we wanted to have workforce median price housing. And so we already have a 5,000 house shortage in Bend, and we're still only building 1,800 a year. And the average need just to keep up, even if we don't try to use that 5,000, is somewhere around 1,900 homes. So we have a big hole to dig out. So both nationwide and here in Bend, we're so short on homes. When we look at housing, there's all kinds of factors that affect pricing over the long range. But the biggest one is simply supply and demand. This is economics 101. And the supply is so constrained. And what we've seen since 2007 is such a historical anomaly. This is going to take a lot of years to oversupply the market.
Yeah, and builders have been methodical over the last couple of years in not overdoing it, not overbuilding and overcommitting. They've been slow, quicker to release unbuilt homes, put them on the market, get them under contract before they even before they even start construction on them. And they're not immune to financing as well. I mean, we know this, that a lot of the bigger projects in town, they rely on commercial banks to lend them money to get those projects started. And so, you know, it all feeds off each other, but absolutely, it's at the end of the day, it's a supply and demand game.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about the supply and demand. We've seen this one's been clear for almost 10 years. The one that really the metric changed in the last 12 months is these interest rates. But the amount of effect that it's had on our inventory has been the massive surprise. And let's talk about that a little bit. So here we have a graph showing that the bottom there are interest rates of home mortgages. It shows that about 70% of all mortgages have mortgages on their house less than 4% right now. Steve, where are we at in today's for a 30-year conforming non-jumbo loan? What's the interest rate?
Yeah, without buy downs, you're in the low 7, somewhere around 7.25.
Oh, okay. So so low 7. But regardless, that's almost a doubling of interest rates. So that's saying that 70% of people, if they were to sell their house and buy one down the street, if they wanted to downsize, their mortgage payment would essentially double, because interest is such a big part of that when you first buy. Your mortgage payment would essentially double for the same price of house. This is causing a freezing of turnover in the market. People just simply don't want to sell their home. So this lock-in that people are having on their house is something that we've really never seen.
Yeah, and you know, the sales that we do see are the people that either own their house outright in cash. I think the stat is about 38% of people own their house outright. And I think it was another 40% or so. So roughly in that same 70% range, own or have more than 50% equity in their home. So those people are going to be less affected, right? They're going to be less affected in selling their home and getting into something else. But the people that we have seen putting their houses on the market are not the lateral moves. They want a different neighborhood and they want to just do a slight upgrade. It's I need more space. I need less space. I'm moving out of town. Otherwise, if it is kind of a smaller reason that's compelling you to move, it's really hard to justify payments that are in some cases double what they would have been or what they're paying.
So we're just seeing an absolute block on resale. So I have another chart. I didn't want to bug you with it today, but it's showing the turnover in housing is about 1/3 of historical average. So history says that about 7 to 9% of homes every year resale. I think right now we're at about 2 to 3%. So people are absolutely locked into their houses with these low interest rates. They're like, I don't want to give it up. And we have all kinds of strategies. We have a lot of sellers that either don't sell, there's bridge financing, there's cross collateralization, there's a bunch of different ways to make this happen. There's ways to talk, interest rate buy downs, et cetera. But we understand why people are a little reluctant. And, if we look at these rates, we're seeing that about 70, 80% of people are not going to make discretionary sales. And it's going to be more dependent on like what Steve was talking about, a life move, a divorce, a marriage, a kid, something like that, that's going to force it to happen until interest rates come down. And it's largely dependent on who you are, especially where you are age, in age demographics. The baby boomers are the ones that are least affected by this. They have the highest percentage of equity in their house. A lot of them own their house cash. But for the younger people, especially millennials, Gen Z, et cetera, that are buying their first house, or perhaps bought a house in the last 3, 4, 5 years, those 8% interest rates or 7% interest rates, excuse me, are a huge threshold or a huge hurdle. And they're not, and one, they're not wanting to sell if they have it, but two, they're having trouble getting in. So we're becoming increasingly reliant upon the baby boomers churn for future inventory. Are you seeing that, Steve, is what product is coming to the market right now?
Absolutely. And on that note, I will say, that let's say the baby boomer generation, they are going to be the ones that are more prone to selling because they can't have as many stairs. They need a little less square footage. Those are the personal factors that do come into these houses coming on the market. They just, the millennials, it's going to affect them more. They're a larger percentage of those buyers are financing, and it will affect them. So absolutely, that's what we're seeing day to day.
Yeah, and then the other part of this that ties into this is that one of the reasons we didn't see downward pressure on pricing versus when we had some softening buyer demand, as opposed to, let's call it 2007, 2008, is people have a lot of equity in their homes right now. If we were to say they at least have 30% or more equity in the home, it's about 68, 70% of all homeowners have at least 30% equity. So even if pricing goes down a little bit, they don't have to sell, they don't have to foreclose, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of durability and equity built into the housing market that we didn't before. And we're just going to rely on a lot of those people that own homes free and clear, where they don't care if they sell in today's market. They're happy to, and because they're not paying off a low interest rate loan. So with,
and
hopefully,
if I could,
yeah,
sorry, if I just wanted to jump in real fast, another factor in there, and this is where we would have you speak with a lender or a banker, is that also presents opportunities for you to get into something else. If you do have that equity, that's yet another source that you can use to tap into it. Because people are always doing that delicate dance of, do I sell and then buy? Do I buy and then sell? And how do you work that? And so again, assemble a team, talk to us, talk to your lender, talk to your banker, and kind of work through what options there are. As this chart showing, 70% of the people have more than 50% equity in their homes. That does provide an opportunity to make a down payment on something else and strategize about when it makes the most sense to sell and when it makes the most sense to buy.
Yeah, and we'll get to that here as we kind of close the buyer and seller tips, because we feel that waiting for the herd to move is often too late. And we don't ever encourage anyone to get over leveraged, to stack too many if then what happens, and it creates a domino effect that if that other house doesn't sell, so all of a sudden they have 2 mortgage payments that exceeds their ability. And we see a lot of that happening in the market. But if you can put together a strong, safe plan, what Steve was just talking about right now, you'll be ahead of the competition, because as interest rates come down, which everyone's predicting that they're going to be coming down in the next 1 to 2 years, the Fed policy has changed, et cetera. There's going to be a change in the market. And if you can beat that market and perhaps get loans that you buy down the interest rate or refinance in the coming years, you're going to have a one-up, because there's a lot of pent-up buyer demand right now that's been pushed to the sidelines because of this interest rate. And if you can kind of beat everybody to the punch, you're going to be in the driver's seat. So Steve, let's talk first about buyers, and then we'll talk about sellers, and hopefully that'll help put a bow on some of the things that we talked about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this first one, these are the 3 things that are affecting buyers the most. Prices are high, it costs more to borrow, and there isn't a lot to choose from, is really what it comes down to, right? And I think we've talked through all of those. Like Brian was saying, be patient but ready. Have your plan in order so that when the opportunity arises, you can make the most of it. That might not be tomorrow. It might be 6 months from now. It might be a year from now. I do want to be clear. we're not painting this perfectly rosy picture and you should get in. That there is a discussion to be had, and everybody's situation is different. And so just making sure that we're doing what we need to do right now to have that plan in place and have as much information at your disposal will allow you to make that decision so that you're in front of the curve as opposed to behind it. Again, long-term outlook, housing, we can get caught up on the numbers and the interest rates. Generally, people are buying housing for the long term, and you'd be hard pressed to find a stretch of 10 years where housing wasn't one of the best things that you could have your money in. So again, we try to keep that big picture in mind. And yeah, loan refinance possibilities in the coming years. If they come down, absolutely, you can do a refinance. If they don't, you're not sitting on the sidelines and waiting to get things started on your life with hopes of something happening that never really comes to fruition. So again, experts have predicted things before. We'll continue to see how this plays out with interest rates, but if they do come down, you can always do something about that. Brian, you want to go through the seller discussions?
Absolutely. So sellers, a lot of sellers are looking at this market and say there's so little inventory, let's put a big number on it. The difference in today's market as opposed to a couple years ago is that buyers, one, are maxed out. These interest rates have put the screws to them, especially in kind of medium price housing and under. They simply can't afford. Even if they wanted to stretch higher, they can't stretch. Between kind of where housing prices stand and interest rates, you've maxed out a lot of buyers. And two, the buyers have thinned a little bit because there's less churn, and we were just talking about that. There's less buyers moving around in the market. And so when you overprice a home, you misposition a home, you poorly market a home, those homes are being punished. So we're kind of seeing like a barbell of results in the housing market. The houses that are priced well are sold in days. The houses that are overpriced, poorly positioned, are out there for months with a series of price reductions to even get attention. So you have some people whose reality as a seller right now is the sky is falling, and then other homes are selling very, very quickly. Steve, are you seeing that on the daily basis?
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually seeing those. There was a point maybe about a month and a half ago where 45% of the homes sold in a week. 45% of the pending sales were within 1 week. And then there was the whole other end of the spectrum. I will say that is starting to balance again. That's, we're starting to see that there are some that are languishing and overpriced and they will sit. Fewer of them are selling within the first week, but the good chunk of them, about 60% of the houses are selling under that 2-month mark. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And then another point that we like to talk about is a lot of sellers are late to the game. List sooner than you might think you need your exit to be. A lot of people say, oh, summer is the sales season, May, June, I'll hit the market, I'll start thinking about it in March, April, May. What a lot of buyers or sellers fail to realize is that the peak in sales, which is often May and June, are closings. It takes 60 to 90 days to sell a house. It takes 30 days to get the house ready. So you really need to back up from that peak sales about 4 to 5 months, which is usually February, March is when you turn the key and get in the process of trying to sell your home. So a lot of sellers are late to the market, but not only late seasonally, like I was just talking about there for May, June, we're also talking about late to the trend change, which we're going to see in interest rates. So right now, there's so many people that are frozen in their homes saying, I don't want to give up this 3.5%, 4.5% loan when I have to go buy a 7.25% loan. Not only are more buyers going to come to the market when interest rates go down, but more sellers are going to come to the market. So there's a lot of talk in the industry right now is what is our shadow inventory when interest rates come down and people are able to start to move laterally. They want to downsize, they want to upsize, they want to move across town. All those discretionary moves that have been on hold for the last 12 months are going to break, and we're going to create some more competition. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out as far as buyer and seller demand when those interest rates drop, but it's definitely going to bring some seller inventory to the market. So if right now you are selling and you don't have to go get a loan on your next house, you might be able to beat that new inventory that'll be coming on as those interest rates drop. So it's tough to predict exactly when and how, but just I think that's something to keep in mind. That's a new trend that we haven't dealt with in the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
The other thing that I want to talk about as a seller is let's not get too myopic on May of 2022. A lot of people are saying, hey, prices came down off of, my neighbor's home sold for 1.3, 1.4 last year. I don't want to sell mine for $1 million, $1.1 million, or 450 to 550, etc. There was that short peak that we talked about earlier. It was not only seasonal, it was the end of that pandemic rush. And you kind of lose perspective. It's like trying to say, I'll only sell Apple if it's $432 at 408. I don't want to sell it. The issue is like, let's look at it holistically. And what a lot of people are saying is, hey, I'm down, 8% from peak. I'm going to wait for that to come back. And a whole new trend that we're not even forecasting will hit the market. But if you look, anyone that's held a house since the beginning of the pandemic, let's go back to beginning of 2020, you're up about 45 to 50%. So let's not worry about that 8. So it's just a little bit of perspective, because it's easy to get caught on that one number where there was relatively short few sales just for a couple months period that really wasn't reliable market data. And let's just, kind of take a step back and say, what has the house done for me overall as an investment? And where, if I'm selling it, what phase of my life will allow me to move on to? And the most disappointing thing I see in real estate is people's lives get put on hold for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, because they just kind of lose focus and forget that the home can not only be an asset, it can be a liability, and it can be a trap from moving on to the next phase, getting closer to grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're poorly positioned and poorly priced and you miss a selling season and you're holding over for another 6 months till the next year, all of a sudden time gets going pretty fast and a lot of life plans get on hold. So this is one of those kind of, I don't want to call it greed, because it's not fair, because you need to be, we're paying attention, we're working with people's largest asset in life. But just to kind of keep perspective on what a sale means in addition to peak pricing. So I got a little wordy with that one. But I think, Steve, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to add one more comment just to that was, the vast majority of sellers are purchasing something else, right? They're getting into something else. And so if the market, this is what we talk about. We don't make the prices, the market makes the prices. What are buyers willing to pay is, at the end of the day, what the house is worth. And so if you're not able to get what you had hoped for on the sales end of it, there is more than likely you're buying it at a lower level on the other side of it. And so just keeping that perspective of, you're moving from one to another, you're not, for the most part, most buyers and sellers aren't in some isolated environments where they're selling it for lower than they want over here and having to buy it for higher than they want over here. So just wanted to.
Wonderful. Well, Steve, 32 minutes, not too bad.
I think that's one of
pretty
our,
good for us.
Yeah.
We would have been under 30 minutes if you would have put a buzzer on me in that last conversation. But we have a Q&A and chat if anyone wants to have a last minute question with us. But otherwise, we're going to close the webinar here, and you feel free to respond to our post webinar email, and we can engage in that method as well. But for all those that joined us today, thank you very much. We're getting close to the weekend. Have a great weekend, and just know that we're always here for you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Take care.